Hey, what's up, everyone? Welcome to another episode of Coach's Corner. And we did ask you guys for topics, and we got some in the comments. So we're very excited to go into that. Of course, if you guys do enjoy the content, make sure to like, comment, and subscribe. And I'm going to pass it over to Ramses, and he'll go ahead and break down the topic.
Yeah, so we were posting on Twitter the other day asking for topics, and one that really stood out to me personally is finding your win condition. So as the local connoisseur of game plans, I think finding your win condition is kind of what game plans are all about, right? Your game plan is a tool, a set of actions that is designed to get you to your win condition as soon as possible. And so I think for me, the reason why it's interesting is because I think I define win condition a little bit differently than most people in the community do. So the way I think about win condition is when you have set up the conditions for you to succeed. And so not just when you get like that kill, not just when you get that strong combo. No, it's like creating the circumstances in which you can get to that critical hit that is going to win you the game. And so your win condition can be something as simple as like I'm playing Shulk, I'm getting my opponent in the mid range. And so now I'm so much stronger. I have access to all of my strong tools and you don't, right? And so like I have activated my win condition. Or similarly, you can say when Incineroar corners you, now he gets to alone whip you and kill you at 70, right? So win condition activated. And so I think one thing, like the reason I think this is so important is because once you understand what your win condition is, then you can start planning how you're going to get there. Because more often than not, right, like there's a tension in Ultimate. And this is something that I think is not talked about enough. That's something that I've been thinking about a lot recently. There's this tension in Ultimate, and it exists in every single game you play. And that is the tension between doing what is best right now and doing what is best in the long term. And so characters are often easiest when they're the same thing. So like for Roy, probably you want to nair in, and the situation after the nair in is probably still fine, right? And so like right now you want to nair in, and after you nair it in, you're in a situation where you're still strong. But for a lot of characters, that's not the case. And so what you'll find is that there's this tension between like, do I do something to really fix like the present moment? Like I'm in the corner, I want to get out of the corner, let me just like dash deck out. Or do I build my game plan around what is better in the future? So instead, am I gonna like play more passively in the corner and then slowly make my way back to center and then play from there when I'm stronger and I've activated my win condition? And so by being aware of your win condition, you know what the long-term plan should be, and that helps you fully realize what the tension is, because oftentimes what you have to do in the moment is pretty intuitive. But most of the times when you get hit, the actual issue, right? Like the actual reason why you got hit is something that you can only find out when you're like VOD reviewing and you go back like a second or two and you figure out, oh, I did this dash here and then I had to shield because it was a bad dash forward and now I'm stuck in shield and that's why I'm rolling and then I got hit for my roll, right? And so a lot of people are like, oh, I shouldn't have rolled there. But in reality, the way to fix that problem is by not doing a bad dash forward in the first place. But the only way that you can know that is by understanding that, like in the long term, this dash forward is going to lead into like this pressure situation. And so there's at the end of the day, right? It's not like you're always playing for your win conditions, and you're not always playing for the long term only, because there's got to be a point where you're playing for the short term. You're playing in the moment. You always play in the moment to some degree, right? And so there's this balance. And again, a bit of tension here, where you should play for the moment to some degree, but also for the long term to some degree. And so a good example of that could be, and I know I'm already like rambling, and I'll pass it to you guys in a second, but I have a lot to say about this. So like a good example of this would be like, let's say I'm cornering my opponents. Like I'm playing Cloud, simple example, character wants to Becker you. I'm playing Cloud, I want to corner my opponent. The short-term action here is like I'm going to short hop forward, I'm going to Becker them, and even if they shield, doesn't matter. Like the short hop Becker, very oppressive, very hard to deal with, puts me in a good situation, I can pressure them, blah, blah. But if we think about like the long-term best thing to do, it's probably to back air and kind of like back air in place and cover like a potential roll in. Because if they roll in, I cover it, so I'm kind of like denying their favorable interaction. And even if I whiff, I'm like still fine, right? And so like if I'm thinking, okay, I want to capitalize on the moment, then I'm like going in and pressuring. And so this is like the high reward, but it also introduces a risk where the opponent can roll in. And so playing for the moment often is a little bit more committal, a little bit more confrontational, a little bit more high risk, high reward usually. And I'm not saying it's high risk, high reward, it's just higher risk and higher reward than playing for a more long-term plan where you're often playing around like these worst case scenarios and you're making sure that even in the situation after the current one, you are still favorable, right? And so that's that tension. And there's going to have to be a point where you're cornering someone where you're going to have to go for it and actually pressure them. And there's going to be a point when you're playing around like the future situation where you actually commit to a situation. And I think a lot of current Ultimate is that balance. I think at the top level, knowing when to commit to a situation and like play it out more committally, and when to kind of like dance around the situation and play for a stronger future situation. Like making that decision when to do which, I think that is really, really important. And I think a lot of people would never have to get coaching from me if they just followed that bit of advice. And I don't mean never as in, but I mean, it would take a lot longer, because a lot of my sessions eventually like come down to that truth. It's like, okay, either you're committing too much in these situations when you should not be committing yet, or you're not committing enough when you're already in a position to commit. And so I think this really is a very, very important skill in the current meta of Ultimate. And so that really ties into finding your win condition. In terms of finding your win condition itself, do you have anything to say about that, Charles? How would you go about finding your win condition if you're like picking up a new character?
It's so hard because the way you find out a win condition is so dependent on the character you play. I think finding a win condition, and it's like kind of a tier list thing. For example, I think your win condition for a character like Snake or a character like Steve is going to be almost the same across the entire board. We were actually, like earlier, Hurt was playing Peanut at Cirque, so we were talking about just, Snake versus Mega Man and Snake versus Game & Watch and stuff like that. And generally, you can tell when a character maybe doesn't struggle, but I mean, I would say most of the time they quote unquote struggle, because I mean, this game is still very underdeveloped, right? Like there's a lot of things that a lot of characters can do. But whenever you see a character play not the usual self, like and I think for Snake specifically, it's surprising because Snake, I would say 90% of the time, can do a game plan and has the same win conditions over and over again, right? That is a very privileged thing to have. So, and same thing with Steve, right? Okay, I'm going to get my diamond, right? Like the whole, I'm just going to build 3 blocks. Obviously, it depends on how characters can break through the blocks. There are characters that can, but most of the time, Steve can do the general same strategy and have the same win conditions. Again, very, very privileged. When we think about some of these toolbox characters that have more movement and stuff like that, your win conditions are more so based on the character that you're playing against, rather than some of these other characters like Snake and Steve that just have really strong win conditions or game plans that they can just go to, right? And if you ever see them play different, you're like, oh man, must be a rough matchup, or they have some kind of tool that disarms the thing, the tool that makes their other game plan so consistent. But with these toolbox characters, especially with movement-based characters, it's what are you playing around, because you have so much tools. So you're trying to figure out which tool to use against which characters / which situations. And I like that Ramses brought up the point of, because this is just a good tip for VOD review in general, but it is all about the decisions leading up to when you got hit. I feel like there's a lot of players that they'll tunnel vision on the RPS situation. So usually it's neutral decision, and then one of the players or both of the players' neutral decisions will force them into a scramble or an RPS. Now, the scramble and RPS, obviously, like you can have patterns and scrambles and stuff like that, but if someone just grabs you shielding, like it's a fighting game, bro. Like that's gonna happen. Did they dash attack you when you dashed back? Like it's going to happen. People call you out. People will just win rock paper scissors. It's not like they're crazy good at the game, or I mean that doesn't mean that they're not good at the game, but my point is that you can't focus on the RPS because that's just guessing. So I mean, you can be more disciplined, I think, in scramble situations. Like I said, there are habits and patterns that players have in scrambles specifically that you could see, but don't focus too much on the actual RPS decision you make. I think the more important decision is how you got there. And that is so important whenever you're thinking about win conditions, because, for example, Fox is a character I play. So For the most part, I kind of break it down because Fox is pretty simple. So I do have the privilege of like, okay, I don't care what character you are. If I put you on a platform tech chase and I up air you, doesn't matter what character you are, you're getting up aired like 3 to 5 times. Doesn't matter, right? And that applies to everything. And that's another really strong thing too, is if you just have universal combos. Fox up air to up air is universal. Like there's no character in the game that can not get hit by that combo at specific, like at a gracious percentage range, right? So because of that, my win condition is a little bit more simple, but the neutral part is where it gets hard, right? Are you playing the vertical fox? Are you playing the horizontal fox? Obviously, you want to play a mix of two, but there's characters like Game & Watch that shut down vertical fox, or like Falco that shut down vertical fox because they have anti-airs that have very high rewards, like to the point where it's maybe even more rewarding than me falling on top of them with Nair. So because of that, I have to play a very horizontal game. I have to abuse my horizontal movement. I have to throw out way more back airs, and the core of my neutral completely changes when I'm playing against Game Watch, because usually Fox can play the vertical game plan, but you have to understand your characters to the point where you can break them down like that, and it can be really simple. Like the example I brought up is not crazy, 5-hit or anything. It's just vertical or horizontal, right? And I mean, obviously Fox is broken enough to have two very strong, like most characters can't play vertical and horizontal really strong. I mean, just to be honest, you have to have very blessed stats to do that, right? Which is why Fox is really good. But the main thing when to me, you have to understand what your character does, especially if he has a wide variety of options, and then you have to lace it around your opponent's win condition and how they play neutral. So it's pretty difficult to do this. Usually I would recommend asking for advice from someone more experienced and stuff like that. But if you really want to take a crack at it, it involves a lot of play testing, I would say. And I think most people would think theory crafting is the way to go. I think you just watch the matchup at top level. That's step one. Just watch the matchup at top level. What do these players do, right? And you're gonna notice certain patterns or certain strategies that the players do, and then you just try to implement it and apply it. And then your own play style will obviously bleed into how you're playing, right? Because you can't do exactly what, like, I can't do exactly what Light does. It's just too fast. Like I literally can't do it unless I practice more and stuff. But that's the whole point, is you have to go through the motions, and a lot of it is experimenting too. So don't get trapped into only theory crafting. I think Tony mentioned this earlier on another episode, but like theory crafting can only get you so far, and playing the game is so much more important, especially in Ultimate. I think a game like Smash 4, theory crafting was crazy because the game was a lot more forgiving in terms of the pacing of the game and how much stress your mental stack had. But in a game like Ultimate, you gotta go through the motions, and to be able to figure out your win condition, it's a lot of experience to go through. But I think for me personally, I think the main thing is neutral is the most important thing, and then how you get the kill. To me, those are like the core of any game plan or just any win condition, because neutral is going to happen right at the start, and it's how you set up a lot of your situations to get the KOs. And I think another great thing for win conditions as well is not getting reversaled. Whenever I feel like I'm playing my best, it's like there's always the situation where I can get the KO or I can apply damage and I just don't get reversaled, because I'm always at like a dash or 2 dashes away from my opponent, and I'm like always ready to whiff punish, and the pressure is always there. And then eventually the up smash will come out of shield, or I whiff punish with it, or something eventually happens where you do get the KO. But I think for most players, whenever they're thinking of win conditions, especially at lower levels, they'll always tunnel into getting, it's like, oh hey, I got them cornered, now it's time to get the big hit, right? When there's so much more to that, because how do I consistently corner pressure? How do I not get impatient and I don't commit, because you're trying to get your opponent to do that? That's generally when you're in some kind of advantageous spot where your character can get a KO. The reason why it's so advantageous is because you don't have to commit. That's what makes it advantageous. But I feel like a lot of players, they view it in the flip opposite way, where it's like, oh, I can get the KO here, so now I do commit, and it's the exact opposite. What are your thoughts, Sony, on finding out these so-called win conditions?
Well, I'm going to go ahead and start off with what's essentially a hot take of I don't generally care about winning. So, when somebody...
I mean, Sonic did get 17th at the invitation. I'm sorry, low blow.
So, generally, when somebody is approaching me for assistance, they're doing so for growth. And generally what growth is going to correlate with is going to be performance, which is generally going to be what people are looking for when they come to me, because they're looking for wins in the first place. So whenever someone is looking for something like winning, that's generally where I start to look for correlation. So I view winning as a side effect of other activities like training. And so I think that the thing that we're generally looking for is what is going to be my training that is going to line me up here. And so essentially we want to produce a training regimen that creates the side effect of winning. And so from there, the first thing we want to do is we want to define, well, what wins in the first place, what actions or board states or whatever generally leads to winning. And to this end, I usually recommend going ahead and doing something like VOD reviewing, but begin at the end and watch in reverse. To start off ideally with matches where someone replicating your circumstances or as near your circumstances as possible is going to be there. So using Charles's example of Light, yes, Charles cannot play as fast as Light. However, you are going to get a better idea on where Charles can start putting his training time by looking at Light win versus, say, looking at T's Pac-Man. So we're going to look at Light's Fox, or if we want to get something that's closer to the circumstances or that Charles can actually provide a context with his training, maybe look at a different Fox like, say, Comet, who is going to play less fast and be something that Charles is going to reach earlier on in his training journey or come closer to. So that the reason being here that the shorter your journey from where you are to where you're aiming for, the more observable the progress between those 2 points becomes, because it's a shorter distance, essentially. So, with that said, and though, as Charles already pinpointed, as a spoiler, is Charles would need to play faster in order to recreate the same circumstances that Light recreates when we look at those VOD. If we go in training mode and try and recreate that, that is going to probably be impossible starting out, because we can't actually replicate the game actions themselves to begin with. And then from there, if we can't even replicate those game actions, then how are we supposed to replicate the circumstances for it? It wouldn't matter if we did, because we wouldn't know that we had done so properly, because we can't execute from that point on. So I know we have mentioned before the importance of execution. This is the place at which point we determine that's importance. It's if I don't have the execution, then it doesn't matter whether I've set it up in the first place. I can't confirm off of it. So with that said, we then, from that point, assuming we could perform that execution, we look at, well, what circumstances or situations is Light creating in order to set up for these combos, for this speed to become a leverage tool that I can use against my opponent. Like what preceded that point. And then that, of course, that's where we look at the points before as we rewind the VOD. And this is where we see not just where we've been hit, but also where our opponent is getting hit. And we can ask ourselves, why are they getting hit? Like what, a common question or observation that I'll hear people make is, I just don't get it. When they're playing versus me, they don't make those mistakes. And then they're playing versus this person, they make those mistakes all the time. Like I've never played the same matchup in my life. So generally this is because they are making those mistakes in response to certain circumstances. Now, part of this can also be maybe the tournament venue was different. Maybe there's other components of the environment that changed. Maybe you're just playing them at a different point in their training career, because things are not necessarily linear on preparation points. So these things do ebb and flow. So with that said, what we want to do to focus on is we want to go ahead and push what we know works and then figure out what can I do to recreate this. And you don't have to actually understand it beyond that point. This is not something where you have to understand the theory of, well, I know that in games where light connects up smash, Fox wins. So, like,
True.
that's well and good, but if you can recreate the circumstances where light's up smashing and getting those to work, go for it. If you pay attention to the percentage that is necessary for the up smash to KO, there you go. From that point on, it's
Tony.
Go ahead.
So a quick example on this. So I have a very hyper specific example. So when light's on point, he hits a tech chase and he gets up smash every single, or like when he's winning, when light's on point, Fox is like, there's a percentage range. I would say it's generally like a maybe 20-ish percentage range for most characters, right? Some characters is bigger, some characters smaller, where if you get nair, it doesn't put them in a tech chase, they slide on the ground and then you just up smash and they die, right? So obviously that's the percentage range where you're like, I cannot get hit by nair. What makes Fox extremely broken is, in terms of just like high skill cap, is that percentage range gets extended if you are also on point. If you just put someone in a tech chase and react to the four options they have, and you just up smash all four of them on reaction, then you've effectively increased the confirm percentage range of nair up smash by, God knows, like maybe 40 more percent or 30 more. Like, it's a lot, and it matters a lot. Can I do that when I'm playing on point? No. You see me tech chase and up smash, I'm guessing. That's just me guessing. But there are other things that I figured out and I've watched other Fox players do, where effectively you can get a nair tech chase and you forward smash, and it's actually a 50-50, where if they tech roll in, that's the only thing that doesn't get hit by forward smash. Tech in place, miss tech, and tech roll away all get hit by forward smash. And if they tech roll away and they're still holding away, they get cheesed at 60 to 70%, right? So there are certain limitations where you have to see a top player do and just be like, I'm not there yet, which is cool. And you can practice doing reactive tech chase, whether it's the training mod or whether it's like in friendlies, and you're like, you know what, I'm not trying to win, I'm just going to try to reactively tech chase with up smash. You try to do it, you up smash someone's shield and you lose the game for it, whatever, right? Like, you wouldn't try to do that in tournament, but you know where you need to be. But there's also little shortcuts that you can get from watching other Fox players, or just, other information like that. But I just had a very specific example for what you were talking about, Tony, so I just wanted to chime in and give it.
Oh, I appreciate it. And that even inspired me to bring up another point. If you're playing a character with a sensitive recovery, look at how they recovered successfully and try and recreate the pattern that they used. You can even recreate it absent of the context for why they're recovering that way. It won't work out for you as well because that context is missing, but I'm willing to bet that for most people, you can't recreate the actual execution of like something such as simple as air dodging to the ledge and auto snapping the ledge that way. Like, these are very basic things that most players are not executing. And so I think in practice, just going through, looking at this, and then replicating it in your play is going to give you immediate improvements as is. So this is how I would improve most activities, most games, most sports, is actually just looking at successful examples within my context, whether it's something like someone with a similar body build to you, someone who's playing the same deck as you, someone who's using your character, etc., etc. Point being, this is going to be a very common circumstance that you can go through and begin with the end, and then recycle it back to the beginning, and then from there recreate those beginnings that lead to the ends that you want. And that's a simple matter of causality. If you like results, repeat the causes that cause those results, and you're more likely to cause that result. Even if it is missing the context that is necessary, you're going to come closer to the actual recipe for success that you're looking for here. And so as you become a more experienced player, though, so obviously this isn't directed toward everyone. However, there are a lot of players I'll speak to who have been playing for the better part of a decade. And So a lot of times you'll hear these players not necessarily able to recognize what is good, but they can recognize what is bad, what is ineffective, because they'll have the raw experience of having played the game enough that they can recognize certain bad habits. Like, oh, I can't believe he keeps air dodging into the ground. Why isn't the opponent punishing that? This is a more literal example of finding your win condition. If you are recognizing, oh, well, I know that these lose me the game, then just to turn that around, empathize with your opponent, and play it from their end of this perspective and say, well, I see my opponent's giving me all these holes that I would lose the game if I was doing. So just recreate those circumstances and then let your opponent lose the game. Just make sure that you are demonstrating to them why it's so bad. Go ahead and give them the charge forward smash into where you know they're going to air dodge, and give them the school of rough knocks that you've come up with. So I think that there's a lot of intermediate players who are capable of recreating these circumstances and simply aren't able to connect the dots there and apply their own understandings to the opponent. If it is not working for you, it probably also does not work for the opponent. So treat it accordingly and recreate those. Another way of looking at this, I would say, which is returning to the training problem, is once you have already a general plan of how you're going to play the game, ideally because you already have a concept of what you're doing, what you're training toward, what you're building at, is that once you have that advanced plan of, oh, I'm going to play like Lights Fox here, it's as simple as when you look at your own VODs now, because you already have a greater roadmap toward your development as a player, is you can identify, okay, well, these points in particular are places where I'm not creating the context that Light had, where I can't get this tech chase. My side B gets hit here when I'm going to recover and Light's doesn't. And then from there, you can go into greater detail. What context is missing? Why does this work for Light and not for me? And then you can kind of take a wider lens view of the situation, and you can look either further back in time or further forward in time to see what it is that would have added context to that situation. Why might the opponent, and I'd recommend starting off by assuming that it's actually correct for your opponent to have missed that because they're responding correctly to something else that then has changed. And so you want to give them credit of saying, this is a rational response to a previous situation that I'm not perceiving. And then because you are looking for it, you're more likely to find it that way because you are now looking for that proper response. So maybe the opponent just decided to piano their buttons and pianoed it on the wrong key there. But I think it's more likely that your opponent is a rational, or rather the player we are looking at versus Light and you is going to be a rational individual who is responding with what they think is the best fit for their circumstance. Whether they are right or wrong, there's still usually a reason or a causal response that leads to that action.
Yeah, I think another big deal too is understanding. I think this is why Ultimate is such a hard game. Not only is it very demanding, how like speed, reaction wise, mental stack, it's also understanding. Not only do you have to understand your own character's win condition, but you also have to understand your opponent's win condition, right? So I think for me personally, there's been a lot of scenarios where I have a huge lead in a tournament set, and then I essentially do I do a string of worst possible decisions ever, and it is the most optimal path for me to lose the game and the shortest amount of time. So understanding your opponent's win condition too, because there's a lot of scenarios where it's like, oh, well, on paper I'm at 0, or like, well, on paper I hit them off stage and they're really far, so I can just get this easy edge guard. But you're at 0%, you just spawned in, it's last stock. Like, what if some weird thing happens and you lose your double jump and then you die at 0, right? Those are scenarios where when those kind of scenarios happen afterwards, you feel like, wow, I really wanted to lose that game. Like, I picked the worst set of options and I put myself in a position where I could get cheesed or I could lose the game really early. And some people react to those in different ways, right? Like, some people get really pissed when that happens to them, like, oh, wow, that's done. But like, again, rewinding it to the part where you made the decision to go for said thing, right? And again, just knowing those kinds of situations and playing around your opponent's win conditions, because usually if you know your opponent's win conditions, you know how you can lose the game in the fastest amount of time, right? So when especially, I feel like it's weird when you have the lead. I feel like you're playing around your opponent's win conditions more than you're playing around your own, because you have a lead. So knowing when to enable your win condition or deny your opponent's win condition is really important. Now, it's a general rule of thumb. It's not going to apply in every single situation, but generally, when you have a percentage lead and you're playing, when you have a stock lead, I should say, not a percentage lead, because percentage like almost doesn't matter unless the timer is like minute or less. That's actually when percentage matters. But for the most part, percentage doesn't matter. It's all about just stocks. So if you have a stock lead, it's more about just denying your opponent's win condition, because I would say most of your win conditions, like, yes, you have win conditions in neutral and for damage and stuff, but I think the main brunt of it all is how you get the KO, right? Because that's how you win the game. So obviously that stems from neutral interactions, winning them and then snowballing them and stuff like that. But for the most part, it's just denying your opponent that stock. So understanding your opponent's win condition, very important. Is it hard to do that when the cast is like almost 90 characters? Absolutely, it's very difficult to do that. But just knowing what your opponent's stray hits are, right? Taking the grab against Fox. There's a lot of scenarios where it's like, okay, well, I can pick my poison here, but I can make sure my stock stays alive. And the longer your stock is alive and you don't lose it, then you put your opponents through more and more skill checks over and over again just to see if they can actually get the stock. But I think for understanding your opponent's win conditions, that one's a bit harder. That one is just like straight studying. How much do you watch the game? How much do you talk about the game? How much do you play the game? Things like that. And you just have to put in the effort, and even just figuring it out in the middle of a game too. I mean, there's certain setups that you'll not. There's no person on planet Earth that knows every single Super Smash Bros. Ultimate setup. There's someone will get hit by a setup that they have never seen before, and you just have to adapt to it on the fly, right? And especially year one Ultimate, that was the case across the board. Like there is so much information to intake. It's very hard to just know everything. So just looking out for specific moves that either put you in bad situations, mainly like tech chases, or that just confirm what are your opponent's stray hit moves for the KO, stuff like that. And just being an expert at denying your opponent's win conditions is also something that's super important on the topics of win conditions.
Yeah.
I'd like to elaborate on that a little bit also, and specifically just point out that as you have a greater lead or a greater deficit, the range of options that specifically are necessary in order to catch that gap are a much smaller. So essentially, whenever there is a big discrepancy in either direction, the number of possibilities that are likely are going to narrow down, and so the game becomes simpler. And so if you understand what your opponent is likely looking for, then you can focus your coverage toward either preventing them from getting those or from juking out your opponent, because you know that they know you want it. Therefore, you can just show them, yeah, I'm going to go for it. And then you just do whatever the counter is. Even if it was something like, oh, I need to make up 100%, what you do is you just bait out them going. Are you looking for a 100% combo? They open themselves up for a 50% combo, and now you only need a 50% combo to make up the rest. And so, yeah, you still need to make up that 50%, but let's say you've theoretically just doubled the number of openings that you now have to find that 50%. And so it's weighted RPS, where you are incentivized for, let's say, well, one thing is going to get you all the way to even it up. The next, let's say, scissors is going to only get you half of the way there. And then obviously going for the draw is, yeah. So once you understand the system, is essentially everything becomes a 50-50, because you can always choose to take the throw, as it were. And so you just play to take the throw and counter your opponent going for the high reward option. And then until you're essentially an advanced player, that's all you really have to do. And you can just do it consistently. And then people will get so caught up in their own heads overthinking that situation that you can just let it fly even past your own skill level, and just kind of plays itself out to you on raw odds, because this is what technical play ultimately comes down to. And speaking of victory conditions, is being willing to roll dice and call those dice based on what is most likely to flip up on the dice numbers. Calling snake eyes or calling 12s, it's not a very winning play. So just go ahead and call the 10s, brother.
Expected value.
Yes, sir.
Yeah, it's like, Tony, it's like, what are my chances of winning the lottery? It's 50-50. You either win it or you don't.
Real.
I wanted to give some really concrete tips on how to find your win condition before we end today's Coach's Corner. So the way I look at it is that there's roughly two types of win conditions, right? There's win conditions that are kind of related to the matchup. So in other words, in which situations are you strong, in which situations are you weak? In which situation? Yeah, so that's like your part, and then there's the same for the opponent, right? So in which situations are they strong, in which situations are they weak? And so our win conditions are going to be the situations in which we are strong, or situations in which they are weak. And their win conditions are situations in which we are weak or in which they are strong. And so how do you figure out whether you're strong or weak in a situation? Well, most of the time, if you are confronted with a weakness of your character, so think about like Greninjas out of Shield game, for example, that would be a situation in which you're weak. So Greninja players often don't find themselves shielding a lot because that situation is one in which they are weak, right? And similarly, a situation in which you're strong is often one in which one of your character's strengths comes to fruition. And so if you want to figure out what your strengths are, generally, you can think about moves that have either really high coverage. So think about like a Joker Nair, right? Covers a lot of options. Or moves that have really high reward. So if we're sticking to Joker, think about like a Joker grab, right? Has one of the most rewarding grabs in the game. And so most of Joker's gameplay comes down to covering a lot with your high coverage tools, Nairs, and then using that to condition into your high reward tool, grabs. And this is what it comes down for most characters, is you use your coverage tool to get our information, and then you use your reward tool to cash in on the information you gained. And so if you want to know when you're strong, again, think about what is your good coverage and where do you cash out, what do you cash out with? And that generally encompasses most of your strengths. Of course, there's more, right? So when you think about like, you can think about like Wario airspeed, and like more attributes rather than moves, but that's, in my opinion, like a step or five away from your starting point. So start by thinking about your strong tools and think about your coverage and think about how you cash in on the information you gained while using your coverage, and that's going to be like the basis of your like quote unquote standard win conditions matchup wise. And then think about what the opponent does for coverage and how they cash in as well. And so most of the time we're going to be playing more so around the way they cash in, because again, if we're thinking expected value, we're avoiding their highest reward option because we don't really know whether they're going to go for it yet. And as we get more information, like it's okay to get hit by a coverage move here or there, as long as we don't get like 0 to death by Kazuya, right? So we can get dash attack by Kazuya like 5 times, doesn't matter. We get electric once, we die, right? And so we let ourselves get hit by the 5 dash attacks as long as we don't get electric, and then we have a read on the dash attack, we can beat it. But if we play around the dash attack from the get-go, we might get electric, then we die. And so we always kind of play around our own coverage while avoiding their reward. And then eventually we adjust that range of options based on what the opponent shows. And then the other thing that you can lean into, and this is kind of like the next step, and honestly a way more advanced step, so it's going to take a while before you get here, but that is playing into your opponent's lack of choices. And so I think, this is my theory, guys, okay? And I want to.
Oh, snap.
This is something I've thought about a lot, and I'm actually interested to hear what you guys think. So I think almost every single set of Smash Ultimate, right, like except for like controller issues, blah blah, have been decided by one of the players either playing choices objectively better, right? So for example, Leo just playing stage control better than his opponents, or one of the players being aware of a choice that the other player is not. And so what you see is that most of the time if a player wins at top level, it's usually because one of them plays the choices better, right? Even if it's just slightly. And the lower you go, the more often you see sets decided by the fact that one of the players is aware of a choice. Like, for example, I have to play for stage control and the other player is not. And so if you're not aware that you have to play stage control, you're not going to make decisions around stage control. And so what does that mean? That means that me, if I know, but you don't, I get the stage control victory every single time, right? And so that is kind of like the second part in which you can identify win conditions. It's like figuring out, okay, the more choices that you're aware of, the more things you can check if your opponent is aware of either, right? So you can say, like, if I'm aware of stage control and spacing and time mix-up and fastball mix-ups and jump arc mix-ups, etc., the more of these choices I'm aware of, the more I can see if my opponent is aware of them. Because if I'm not aware of them, I cannot know if, like, I cannot check if my opponent is aware of them or not, right? And if you can find a choice that your opponent does not make, you can kind of win the set by default.
Mm-hmm.
Of course, at top level, oftentimes it's not the case, and so it often comes down to like who makes a choice more accurately, and you know, a bunch of other things like just natural variance, controller issues, did you sleep well, blah blah blah. But yeah, so that is another way that you can find win conditions, is by not focusing on the characters at all. Because at the end of the day, the character is limited by the player. And so if the player doesn't make that choice, you can abuse them, even though they should be winning. And vice versa is also true. The player is limited by the character. And so if the Greninja player is really good at not shielding, it doesn't matter because like Greninja still has that weakness, right? And so not shielding is still like a weakness that you can abuse. And so you should always look at it from both ways. The character is limited by the player, and the player is limited by the character.
Yeah, finding
The most
win
effective
conditions.
player is the Fundy wrapped in the armor of Gimmick.
I love that. That's great. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, finding win conditions specifically based off the player and not the character, I feel like can be stronger at lower levels of play. It obviously happens at all levels of play, but the part of, oh, you didn't know that happens way less, especially nowadays at top level.
Oh, yeah.
But even just noticing if, hey, and another thing too is most opponents at top level of play, like they're so well rounded, like you're not gonna go in against like a top 5 or top 10 player in the world and be like, oh, okay, they're just really bad at getting off the ledge, so I'm just gonna abuse these like 2 or 3 patterns and they can't get off the ledge. That'll happen a lot more at lower levels of play and stuff like that, right? Where, I mean, even just for example, as a Fox player, there's some times where I just sit there and spam Nair at ledge and I'm like, do they know how to deal with this? Yep. And if they don't, well, looks like they've got like maybe 2 or 3 games to figure it out. But if they don't, then I'm just gonna keep. You don't have to make it complicated. There are a lot of simple things that your character can probably do in certain phases of the game that are extremely strong. And if they don't know, they just don't know. And you can't overthink those situations. Sometimes you have to keep doing it until it's like, hey, until you show me that you can deal with Nair at ledge, I will keep Nairing at ledge. And I will do infinite damage to you because you don't know how to deal with Fox Nair at ledge. If
they don't use paper, why stop using rock? That's what it comes down to.
Yeah, and just noticing what like phases of the game, like, oh, are they do they do certain like panic options? And you can make it really simple too. Do they swing or do they do defensive options? Because unless you're like more at top level, most people will either swing or do a defensive option in disadvantage. When you get at higher levels of play, doing nothing and just landing is more of an option. Like just fastball shield, for example, is like a really good option, stuff like that. But I think at lower levels of play, it's either offense or defense in specific scenarios, and seeing that and trying to find win conditions more so through the player rather than the matchup, right? Where it's like, man, I usually have really a hard time killing, but man, if they always air dodge in this specific spot and I just do like a crazy charge forward smash, like I don't have to figure out how to kill it all in this matchup. I should just abuse the fact that you air dodge here every time and I can just kill you for it, right? Stuff like that.
For sure. And so like I've won a lot of matches that I don't know because I just let trap better, right? Like I'm covering the role. Do you actually know how to get out of the corner? Okay, they full hop, I juggle you. Okay, right? And even if they know, and that's what I was trying to say, like even if they know how to play that corner situation, the expected value is still in my favor, right? Like I'm still like covering better. I still have higher reward. And so I can still play out the situation. But if they don't even know, then who cares? And so like vice versa is also true. Like some players I beat just by rolling in whenever they're stronger than me. Because their perspective is when I'm stronger, I'm gonna pressure the opponents. Okay, so I roll in, you pressure where I used to be, and you're missing. And like I'm chilling. And so like even really good players, like I'm talking like top worldwide players, have these weird like gaps in their strategy where they're not making a choice there. And so if you can identify that again by being aware of the choices, then you're gonna get so many like essentially free wins that make no sense. And then this is also why like when you look at, and I know we praise Sonics a lot on this podcast. When you look at Sonics, for example, he's in my opinion one of the more aware players in the world. Like I hardly see him in a situation where he doesn't know what the choice is, and I see him so often beat people because they don't know what the choice is. And so when you see people complain about Sonic, Sonic's is always like, well, the character is good, guys, but he's not like that turbo broken. And I think a lot of that comes down to people not being aware of the choices that they should be making versus Sonic. And so that is kind of where we go back into like the matchup part, where if a character has unique choices like a Sonic, like a Shulk, like a Sieve, they can force choices on you that kind of knowledge check you. If you do not know how this choice goes and what the like risk reward of every option that you have in the choice is, then they're just going to roll over you because you don't know, right? And so again, there's a balance here of knowing the players and knowing the characters.
And I will definitely confirm that like part of our approach to studying the neutral is finding high risk or solid neutral.
Wait, Tony, could you restart?
Yeah, you cut out a little bit.
Yeah, finding neutral, or you're talking
in neutral. You're looking for.
Yeah.
Yes, and neutral, we're generally looking to kind of feel out what the opponent is vulnerable to without actually committing pieces to the board. So essentially gathering information while not really giving as much, or being mindful of what information is being given to also take that to an advantage, and how to perceive when the opponent is receiving that information, etc., etc. So if neutral is a conversation, then how to identify when your opponent's listening to what you're saying and whether or not they speak your language.
There you have it. Did you guys have anything else on the topic?
That's all my thoughts. Thank you.
I have no thoughts. My head is empty.
All right. Well, we would love to hear your thoughts in the comment below. So if you guys did enjoy the episode, make sure to like, comment, and subscribe, and let us know how you feel about this topic, finding win conditions, denying your opponent's win conditions. Would love to hear everyone's thoughts on that. And of course, if you guys want to support us even more, you can go ahead and subscribe to our Discord, and you can ask us any questions and we'll make an episode out of it. So yeah, most of our episodes are questions, so it's been really good. Thank you for everyone that has been supporting us on Discord, and hope you guys continue to do that and continue to ask more questions. And of course, until next time, class dismissed.